Welcome to the debate. Our discussion today centers on the historical interpretation of one of the most significant weapons of the 20th century, the T-34 tank. And we're looking specifically through the lens of the source material, T-34 Sitanggunuh. For our listeners, that title translates roughly to the tank that saved the nation.
And this documentary script, it really captures the tank's duality, doesn't it? Portraying it as both, a potent machine of war and, at the same time, a really profound cultural symbol.
Exactly. And that brings us to the essential conflict, the question for our debate today. Does the T-34's primary historical significance lie in its material and technological efficacy? I mean, the physical machine that actually secured military victory? Or does it lie more in its powerful symbolic function as the embodiment of, say, the Soviet nation's resilience and that unwavering spiritual will the text talks about?
Right. A key distinction.
So I'll be making the case that the tank's material contributions, its decisive technological role, were the paramount factor here. And its symbolic status really just flowed directly from its physical performance on the battlefield.
And I'll be coming at it from a slightly different angle. I believe the source material intentionally elevates that symbolic function. It suggests that the T-34's enduring historical weight lies less in its technical specs and more in its role as, well, a vessel representing the collective Soviet spirit and national resolve, a kind of spiritual victory that just happened to use the machine as its manifestation.
Well, I think to truly understand why this machine became such a legend, we really have to start with the cold, hard facts of its engineering. The source calls the T-34 a machine that would change the entire battlefield. And honestly, that's a testament to its design superiority, especially in the early years of the war. We are talking about the revolutionary sloped armor, which offered vastly superior protection compared to, say, the German vertical plates at the time, and the powerful V2 diesel engine that gave it speed and an operational range that its contemporaries just couldn't match. The material emphasizes that the victories, right from the initial defensive lines in 41 all the way to the final advance into Berlin, were fundamentally enabled by this superior military asset, one forged, as it says, from cold steel and sweat. You know, that famous endurance test run by engineer Mikhail Koshkin, his long-distance prototype drive? That was a demonstration of material endurance, of mechanical reliability. It proved the tank was fit for purpose when the battle line called. The T-34 was, basically, the tangible presence that allowed the Red Army to physically push back evil from Europe. The physical capabilities, I argue, defined its destiny.
Okay, that's a compelling case. Based on the specifications, I see that. But I do worry that focusing purely on the physical misses how the narrative consistently elevates the symbolic. I mean, this source material consciously designates the T-34 as a legend, and even the soul of Russia in the darkest days. Now, that kind of language suggests the authors believe the most important strength is, and I'm quoting here, not in weapons, but in the will that never yields. You mentioned Koshkin's drive, a feat of engineering, sure, but the text explicitly describes that event as testing the will of the nation, not just the vehicle's chassis or its engine. The material is purposefully, I think, reframing physical action as a form of spiritual commitment. And even at Kursk, the huge battle where T-34s crushed the bride of Nazi Germany, the description is very carefully layered. It wasn't fought just with artillery shells, the text says, but with the will of millions of people behind it. So the ultimate significance the source seems to assign is cultural, a representation of courage and the unwavering spirit, which, survives long after the material facts of the war itself have faded.
Let's maybe ground this debate in the most critical physical confrontation the source describes, which is the turning point at Kursk, covered in Scene 5. The text calls this the largest tank battle in human history. It says thousands of steel machines crashed into each other. Now that is a description of material conflict, pure and simple. If the machine itself had failed technologically, if the 76mm main gun, or later the 85mm upgrade, hadn't been sufficient to penetrate the frontal armor of the Panzer IVs or the Tigers they faced, or if the engines had consistently overheated on the advance, well, no amount of national will could have compensated for that kind of physical failure on that scale. The physical forces colliding determined the immediate outcome. The victory there was secured because, as the source puts it, The tread of the T-34 physically crushed the enemy's formation. We have to acknowledge that the symbol only gained its potency because the material asset delivered a world historical victory.
I see why you tie the symbol directly to the physical necessity of winning the battle. Absolutely. But I think the narrative construction of Scene 5 almost immediately undermines that claim of purely material primacy. The text sets the scene with the physical clash, yes. Thousands of steel machines crashed, it says that. But it immediately pivots the explanation for the victory away from mechanics and squarely towards spirit.
Immediately? I'm not sure it's immediate.
Well, look at the phrasing. The victory is attributed to the collective human resolve, which merely manifested through the tank. The language used transforms the machine into the symbol of the turning point. When the text explicitly states the tank fought not just with artillery shells, but with the will of millions of people behind it, well, that shifts the causal weight, doesn't it? It moves it from material superiority, armor and guns, to spiritual commitment, the will of the millions. The tank was the instrument, sure, but the spirit was presented as the driving force and, I'd argue, the focus of the author's intended meaning.
But that spiritual commitment, however intense it might have been, it needs a reliable, mass-produced conduit to actually do anything on that scale. I mean, if we pivot to look at the home front production described in scenes 2 and 7, we see the true scale of the material advantage emerging. The relentless labor in the factories, the sound of hammering, welding, and the breath of steel that resulted in sheer overwhelming supply. This is an undeniable logistical factor in winning a long war of attrition. While the Germans often prized complexity, maybe over-engineered their tanks, the Soviets perfected rapid, simplified production of the T-34. The emphasis, I think, should be on the output, the sheer number of T-34 units manufactured, often with simplified components just to speed up assembly, which allowed the Red Army to simply overwhelm the enemy through numbers, through attrition and presence. The factories were producing hope, yes, but in the tangible form of war machines.
And it was that quantitative advantage, a wholly material factor, that really determined the outcome of such a prolonged conflict.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the output is prioritized over the motivation for that output in this text. Let me tell you why. The text consistently describes the home front activity as almost a spiritual endeavor. It redefines the labor itself. The workers weren't simply meeting quotas in the source's view. They were forging steel, welding armor, casting faith into the shape of T-34.
Casting faith, yes, it uses that phrase.
Exactly. The production process itself is treated with this almost religious fervor. The work is described as the rhythm of a country that never stopped fighting. So the strategic advantage wasn't just the number of tanks produced, it was the symbolic value of the effort itself. The fact that the country, despite horrific suffering, the cold, the darkness, refused to sleep and just kept building its legend, that provided the morale boost, the national identity necessary to sustain the fight. This refusal to yield, this sheer dedication, created the strategic advantage in a way. The tank was maybe the physical embodiment of the nation's sustained spiritual effort to survive, which is arguably a more potent historical factor, at least in this narrative, than just the technical efficiency of the production line.
That spiritual reading of factory labor is compelling. I grant you the text leans that way, but the source uses the physical reality of production, the hammering and welding, to describe the creation of what was, at the time, a superior war machine. The sheer logistical achievement is historically staggering. I mean, the Soviet Union moved entire factories eastward, under fire, and maintained a production rate that absolutely dwarfs the Axis powers. This material reality ensured that even when a T-34 was knocked out, another was often ready almost immediately to take its place. This material resilience, the simple ability to replace the loss, is what ultimately ensured victory, not just the abstract will to keep working. The quantitative edge born of logistical genius is a material achievement that I think transcends purely symbolic significance.
But if the goal was simply to highlight logistical efficiency, why cloak it in such profound, almost spiritual terminology? If the source authors just wanted to emphasize logistics, they could have focused on supply lines, material procurement data, engineering standardization details. Instead, they choose language like casting faith. The text seems to be making a philosophical point. The reason the factories ran, often with women and children working impossible hours under terrible conditions, was rooted in a belief system, a kind of spiritual fortitude that the machine, the T-34, came to represent. Therefore, the historical gravity in this telling is placed on the intangible will that drove the creation of the physical machine, transforming the material output into a symbol of collective sacrifice and determination.
Okay, let's turn our focus then to the T-34's enduring presence in peacetime, as described in scenes 9 and 10. Because this is where the machine's legacy is truly sealed, perhaps. In peace, the T-34s are described as witnesses of time, importantly, with scratches on the steel armor. The continuing significance of these physical attributes seems crucial to me. They serve as a constant reminder that, quoting again, peace is never obvious, but always bought with blood. The memory is rooted entirely in the physical sacrifices made by the steel itself, and of course by the soldiers inside. The tank's legacy seems tied inexorably to the physical history of combat, the material reality of loss, which is why the physical damage remains so poignant when we see them in museums. It's the material evidence of the fight that we continue to memorialize.
That's a compelling point about the physical scars, but I think you stop just one sentence short of the narrative's intended conclusion there. When viewed in the museum, yes, it has scratches, but the tank isn't primarily defined by its specifications or its damage in the text. The source calls it an immortal legend, a symbol of faith, courage, and unwavering spirit. And the final lines, I think, provide the definitive shift. The text concludes by stating that its rolling treads still echo, reminding the world that true strength, the ultimate strength, is non-material. It is, again, the will that never yields. This final definitive statement seems to shift the ultimate historical weight away from the physical artifact, the steel, the armor, the scratches, and firmly towards the cultural and ideological meaning it embodies, a meaning that outlives the conflict itself.
But surely the reason those scratches and physical imperfections hold such meaning is precisely because they represent moments when the material held up against destruction. If the tank had routinely disintegrated or failed its crew under fire, the physical scars wouldn't be those of a victorious legend, would they? They'd be symbols of a failed relic. The very fact that the steel survived the conflict is what allows it to become an immortal symbol. The symbol is predicated on the material's success. You simply can't separate the efficacy from the icon.
And I would argue the narrative is structured to suggest the exact opposite relationship, that the spiritual essence is primary. The tank is treated almost like a crucible, a test. The T-34 was a necessary tool, yes, absolutely, but the source emphasizes that the victory achieved through it ultimately proved the enduring power of the nation's spirit. The material success merely validates the text's central point, that spiritual strength can be made manifest in physical action. It is the spirit that is framed as immortal, and the T-34 is presented as its powerful yet ultimately finite vessel.
I certainly acknowledge the powerful emotional resonance and, yes, the spiritual framing that the source places on the T-34. It's undeniable. However, I must reiterate my core point. The narrative of national salvation presented is intrinsically linked to the tank's actual material success in critical campaigns like Kursk and the final push into Berlin. The T-34 was, quite literally, the physical vehicle that allowed the pushing back of evil, as the text puts it. Its symbolic status flows directly from its proven technological superiority and its logistical effectiveness on the battlefield. You simply cannot forge a legend, in my view, from a machine that consistently fails to deliver victory.
And I maintain that this narrative carefully, perhaps even deliberately, distinguishes between the tangible weapon and the intangible spirit. The T-34, from Koshkin's initial grueling test drive right through to its final placement in museums, functions as a powerful rhetorical device in this story, a vessel for national will and ideological steadfastness. Its power as a legend, which clearly endures long after the fighting stopped, demonstrates that its most crucial contribution, according to this source, was to embody and galvanize the Soviet will to survive. It aimed to prove that the deepest strength the source wants to highlight lies ultimately in the human spirit,
not just in the steel itself.
So we have explored the intricate duality of the T-34's legacy as presented here, resting simultaneously as both a powerful material achievement and an enduring symbolic icon, all rooted firmly, we should stress, in the text of The Tank That Saved the Nation.
Leaving the listener, as always, to weigh the evidence presented in the source material and consider, perhaps, where the tank's true historical gravity lies, at least within the context of this particular telling.